Reclaiming clay. I've got a bucket of dry clay here, and you can tell that it's bone dry because not only is it lighter in color, but it's not cool to the touch. And that tells me that there's no more moisture inside of this clay. And dry clay rehydrates really efficiently, much better than leather hard clay. So it is worth taking the time to dry out your scraps completely before you try to rehydrate them. So over here all I have is just water, a little less than halfway full in this bucket, and you can just drop this dry clay into the water, and then I'll need to let it sit at least overnight, but probably a day or two to fully reabsorb that water. Then I will mix the clay either by hand or using a hand mixer, and then I will reconstitute it using my plaster slab and some wedging. When you have let the slip sit overnight, sponge off the water that's resting on the top or pour it off so that what you're left with is pure slip. It should be at least a yogurt consistency, although it's important to add enough water to fully liquefy the slip. So if it's a little bit thin, just let it settle more and pour off any clear water on the top. What you should be left with is this thicker slip, which then we're ready to put back on our reclaim slab and start the drying process. If you don't have a drill mixer, then your slip may be a little more lumpy and less consistent than what you see here, but that should be just fine as long as there are no hard chunks left in the slip. These lumps that you see are squishing nicely between my fingers, so as long as it's softer consistency than you would want to work with, then you're totally fine, and you don't necessarily need that mechanical mixer. So all you'll do now is just scoop out that slip onto the reclaim slab, and you want a generally even thickness of slip across the whole thing so you don't get one section drying out faster or harder than the rest. And you want it to be relatively thick, like at least an inch thick, again, so that it doesn't dry out too quickly and it dries evenly. So just do your best to scoop, kind of like making pancakes, a nice thick layer of clay all the way over the slab. And you can go right out to the edges if you don't mind making a little bit of a mess. This is probably a good thing to do outside, again, if you have access to any outdoor space. You can tell it's a bit messy. Now I'm going to leave this, that looks pretty good. I'm going to leave this outside in the open air so the wind helps dry it out. But I'm not going to put it in direct sunlight unless I'm really trying to rush the process, because again, the sunlight can really speed the drying process, and even though we want that, it can lead to it becoming a little bit uneven. So I'll just leave it in the open air in the shade to get a more consistent result. And it's really important that I catch this before it hardens too much. I want to catch it right at that phase where it's a little bit softer than it is when we pull it out of the bag, so that then I can wedge it easily, and by the time I'm done wedging, it'll be a nice consistency to work with. If you let it go just a little bit too far though, and it's too stiff, it's very difficult to rehydrate that without going through the reclaim process a whole another cycle, which is a lot of work. So better to be a little bit on the soft side than to be too much on the stiff side. I'm guessing this is probably going to take several hours, and then I'll check it. So maybe 2 hours before I check it. Now, if you're somebody who's planning to do a lot more clay work at home, I want to show you this method because a lot of potters who dig local clay will use this to reclaim larger batches at a time, because this would be rather unwieldy to make a plaster slab of this scale. What they'll do is just make this wooden box with a hardware cloth, a metal mesh in the bottom like this, something that won't rust. And then they'll take bed sheets or other finely woven fabric and lay that into the form. Then they'll go ahead and pour the slip in here and cover it. And the water will leach through the fabric and will dry out, but the fabric will also maintain an even consistency around the surface so that it won't dry and form like a hard crust on the outside. This will take a bit longer because there's no plaster to actively absorb moisture out of the clay. So I'm going to leave this and check it every day, but I'm imagining it's going to take several days before it's a workable consistency again. If you're unfortunate enough to let your clay dry out too far and it's just slightly too stiff to work with, or in this case if you're using clay from a very old bag that has just stiffened up too much to be really workable, one thing that sometimes works is to leave the clay in the bag and submerge the whole bag in water. This will allow some moisture to penetrate through the plastic and slowly soften up the surface, although this is definitely not an ideal way to try to reconstitute clay. Sometimes it's worth it though in a pinch rather than going through the entire reclaim cycle again. If you happen to have two plaster slabs, sometimes it's nice to sandwich the reclaim between the two so that there's moisture being pulled out of both sides equally. You can tell that it's done because the plaster on the top will lift off without pulling a lot of clay with it. And if you don't have two slabs, like most of us won't, one way to tell if it's done is the reflection of the moisture on the surface will go away and it will look more of a satin texture, similar to making pancakes. The other way to tell is when you touch it, if you can pull it off of the plaster and it comes off cleanly, like that, then you're in good shape. If you're pulling off sections and some of it is still sticking to the plaster, not releasing, that means it's probably still got a little ways to go. So sometimes what I'll do is maybe halfway through the drying process, this has been outside for about 4 hours. So if I only had one slab, maybe I would flip it over at about 2 hours in. And so that way it's just maybe keeping things even. But if you're trying to pull the clay up and it's not releasing off the slab, it's just not ready yet. So just give it a little longer. You may even end up letting it sit overnight before you're really able to peel it off effectively. So if that's the case, just be patient. But when you're done, this should be a lot softer than what's in the bag of a fresh bag of clay. And you can see here, this is not really workable clay. This is so soft. I can barely wedge it normally. But that's okay, because I'm going to wedge it right here on this plaster. And it's going to continue to pull a little moisture out as I do this. And I can just do this to get a feel for it and see if there's any lumps in there that need to be worked out. This is feeling nice and consistent, just how I like it, but it is still a little soft. So that's the other thing, is you can start wedging here, and if it's just too sticky to really use, just lay it back out on the slab and let it keep going. If you have a two-sided slab that's clean on both sides, ready for white clay, mine is red on the back, so I'm not going to do that. But you could flip the slab over to have a dry side that's going to pull more moisture out. This side is pretty well saturated, but it's still going to still going to help us. So I'm just going to leave this another hour or two and then come back and try wedging it again, see if it's changed. What you really want to look out for is around these edges. If you have any thin spots, especially around these edges, they're going to dry out pretty quickly, and you could get harder spots that just aren't going to rehydrate again when you start wedging. So be really careful that the edges are round, and any of these crumbs or flakes, they get a little too dry. It's better to just go ahead and discard those into your reclaim bucket rather than to try to wedge them into good clay, because you'll just end up ruining a good batch of clay with some lumps. Okay, so another hour or so, and then I'll come re-wedge that, and it should be just right. I think I'm going to try wedging it again and see if we're ready for bagging this up. So I'm assuming there's a lot of air trapped in this coil right now because of the way I just rolled it up. So I'm going to wedge this extra well on the plaster. And if my plaster isn't too saturated, it's still going to be pulling moisture out of the clay as I'm wedging. And the heat from my hands actually is going to help maybe evaporate off a little bit of moisture as well. So I'm going to wedge this pretty thoroughly. It's really important to wedge your reclaim a lot because it doesn't have any of that density or compression or vacuum pressure sucking air bubbles out like you would get from running your clay through a pug mill. And so we're going to have to wedge a lot to get it back to a similar consistency to what we get straight out of the bag. But the good news is this reclaim is a little bit softer than what's in the bag still, so the wedging is a lot easier because the clay is so much softer. You can see that spiral maybe. It's happening there, the seashell method. So I'm just going to do this maybe like 200 strokes or so to get this all nice back to workable consistency. It is a little bit stiffer than it was, still a little bit softer than what's in the bag, and that's kind of where I want to be. I don't mind my clay being just a hair softer than normal, but if you'd like, to match it perfectly, you can always adjust your drying times to do that. Whenever you're done wedging with this piece and it's the right consistency for what you're doing, just bag it up, wrap it up tightly, and you're good to go. You can use it in your next project. That's reclaiming.